I'm thrilled to have on Bad Faith Podcast for the first time Kit Klarenberg. You know him probably as the chief investigator at GrayZone UK, but also the co-founder of Active Measures, which is another investigative project. Welcome to Bad Faith.
Hey, Joy, how's it going?
I'm doing well, thank you. I love that you called me Joy. Only my grandfather used to call me Joy, and it puts a smile on my face. Um, we were talking a little bit before we started recording, and about the fact that the last time that you were on, or rather, the last time that I spoke to you was on Rising, shortly after you had been detained in the UK, right, for some of your reporting. Remind us what happened then, and I want you to have a chance to elaborate, given that you were directly targeted as a journalist for your journalism, on what you make of this very authoritarian crackdown on speech that has been happening in the United States for a while now, but ratcheted up since Trump has come in office.
Yeah, sure. In many ways, looking back on it, I think I was somewhat a test case, because back in May 2023, I flew back to my home country of the UK, and I was met on the tarmac by six armed counter-terror police, and marched into a back room with the pleasant offer of a 6-hour interrogation, under which I would have no right to silence, and I would have to hand over the PIN codes to all my digital devices so they could be strip searched, or arrest and prosecution for failure to comply. So I complied. It was a story which, yes, it was picked up across Europe and the US. The UK media, typically compliant, had not a word to say about it. Since then, it's become an almost monthly, if not weekly, occurrence that people entering the UK are stopped using counter-terror legislation because of their positions on Israel-Palestine, on the Ukraine proxy war, and the in December, last December, the UN wrote to the British government expressing grave concern about this practice and demanding answers and clarity on why counter-terror laws were being used to harass and persecute, and in some cases, such as Richie Medhurst, arrest independent journalists and activists because of their opinions and perspectives. The British government ignored the letter and then only ramped up the repression. My friend, an academic, David Miller, hardcore anti-Zionist, he was a mere weeks back stopped entering Heathrow again. Had a welcoming committee of multiple counter-terror officers waiting for him on the tarmac. So, in the manner of these things, it does seem that brazen tyranny, to coin a phrase, is trickling throughout the Western world. We have seen a large number of crackdowns across Europe and North America on Palestine solidarity activists. Of course, most recently, Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestine activist who was in the US on a green card, got effectively black cited and thrown into prison into Louisiana for protesting at Columbia in support of the Palestinians. So I do think that, yes, in the manner of these things, this is just the beginning. And authorities across the West are becoming increasingly comfortable with just absolutely brazen crackdowns on dissenting opinions and individuals, because they know they can get away with it, and the mainstream media typically won't cover it.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Your case and Medhurst and others were such canaries in the coal mine. I do think that some difference, the fact that they happen in the UK and the fact that Europe, generally speaking, doesn't have the same sorts of speech protections that the United States has and has always, put on a pedestal. It's, the First Amendment, made people, I think, perhaps overly confident that that sort of thing wouldn't happen here, or didn't pay sufficiently close attention to it when it was ongoing. And now that so many of the incidents of speech repression are happening to people who are either not American citizens, are green card holders, permanent residents, and the like, or there was the case of the American citizen who was Latino, who got spirited away, separated from his ID, even though the ID obviously proved that he was American. But because he wasn't white American, perhaps, hypothetically, maybe, it also gives people a sense of comfort. I did see in the wake of that story, some conservatives tweeting things like, oh, well, this is the policy. We're deporting illegals. If a couple of Americans get caught up in the crossfire, well, they're just going to have to deal with it. They can suffer a little bit in jail for a little bit of time. I mean, there's a very casual bargaining away of other people's civil liberties. It is also now escalating to a place, though, where there was a German national that got caught up this past week. Another green card holder detained at an ICE facility. And I do wonder if we've hit a tipping point, frankly. I see people like Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeting, like, I didn't sign up to litigate additional wars. I do see some conservatives, Thomas Massey, coming out against the detention of I think it was Mahmoud Khalil specifically, that he came out against the detention of him. Do you feel like there is a tipping point? And even if that's the case, does it really matter? Do you see increasing public outrage about these incidents actually leading to any restraint on behalf of either the Trump administration or other national administrations around the world, like the one you were a victim of?
I mean, not at all. And I think that there, you mentioned the at least theoretical protections that Americans should enjoy, under the Constitution, which are not typically extended to Europeans. I mean, this is happening everywhere. For many of your viewers, I would imagine that Romania is a faraway land of which they know nothing, and for that they're forgiven. But I mean, recently, last year, Romanian authorities overturned the results of a presidential election because it looked like a anti-war, anti-NATO candidate might win. And then he's since been barred from standing for re-election. Another outsider candidate was likewise recently banned from standing explicitly because she held anti-NATO views. It's just becoming more and more open because, yes, while there is significant controversy and pushback at a public level, governments feel no compulsion whatsoever to even attempt to reflect public opinion anymore, because they are so protected. It's quite a remarkable situation. If you look at, say, polls in the US or Europe, overwhelmingly citizens support Palestine. Their governments don't. Their governments feel absolutely, zero pressure whatsoever to even soften their rhetoric or amend their support for Israel as it's committing, what is unambiguously a genocide, despite, ICC and UN rulings. The silver lining here, and there is one, is that typically repressive power structures become most repressive when they're on the verge of collapse. Like, it is a fundamentally unsustainable situation where supposedly democratic governments in no way reflect the needs, wishes, or interests of the people who elect them. It's just a pity we have to live through the short-term autocracy, which is probably only going to ratchet up further, particularly if Europe gets its way and the Ukraine proxy war just grinds on forever. Again, despite widespread public and growing state level opposition to this.
Yeah, that's a really perfect segue to the main topic for the day, which is developments in Ukraine. It's been a while since we did a Ukraine episode, and I saw your coverage of this issue, tweeting regularly about it, and I really respect what you guys over at the GrayZone, including Aaron Mate, have come and explained on this podcast. I was saying this to you a little before we started recording, that I confess that this is one of my weaker areas, and my brain tends to be like a sieve. So if the audience can have some patience with me, or maybe you're like me, that you would appreciate an update on the historical analysis of how we got to this point in Ukraine. you referred to this as a sort of a Ukraine derangement syndrome that most of the Western media has been laboring under. How would you describe what the Ukraine derangement syndrome is? And then what is the truth? And feel free to start back in 2014 or earlier to the extent you think that that's clarifying and helpful.
Sure. So, I mean, the established and kind of indomitable mainstream narrative on the proxy war in Ukraine is that it began on February 24th, 2022, much like the Israel-Palestine quote-unquote conflict. It's not a conflict. It's a one-sided genocide perpetrated by Israel, began on October 7th. The reality is that for decades following the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, there were concerted efforts by the US and Britain particularly, but other Western powers, including Germany, to integrate Ukraine into the Western fold. Now, Ukraine has been inextricably, culturally, linguistically, historically linked to Russia for centuries. And the modern Ukrainian state is effectively a product of the Soviet Union. The very word Ukraine means borderland. So for centuries, Ukraine, which primarily consisted of Kiev, was a borderland of the Russian Empire. Under communism, its territory slowly but surely began to grow. It incorporated lands that were historically Polish and Romanian. After World War II, it was given Crimea in the 1950s, but which is a historically Russian peninsula by then leader Khrushchev. The Donbass, which is again historically Russian territory, was given to what was the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic following the Russian Revolution in 1917. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, what was effectively an administrative unit of a wider call it an empire, say, became all of these arbitrary lines drawn on a map became binding national borders. And it meant that an enormous number of people who identified as Russian and spoke Russian, Ukrainian being a subdialect of Russian, became citizens of a newly formed country, which hadn't hitherto existed in any meaningful way. So this was viewed by many at the time as problematic, and there are declassified British Foreign Office documents from the 1990s where it is discussed that that there is a significant proportion of the Ukrainian population who do not identify as Ukrainian, but this was viewed as a potential wedge issue, which in order to kind of trip Russia up, pressure Moscow into giving concessions, etc. Following, as I say, for decades, there were attempts to bring Ukraine into the Western fold, and all that entails NATO membership, EU membership, despite the fact that there was never majority support for joining either. In 2004, there was a Western orchestrated color revolution known as the Orange Revolution, which overthrew the legitimate president, Viktor Yanukovych, and installed a pro-Western puppet who pushed for privatization, NATO membership, etc., despite, again, widespread public opposition. He was voted out in 2010 and Yanukovych was re-elected. And then in November 2013, Yanukovych, who was by no means the Russian puppet he is frequently portrayed as in the Western media, was on the verge of signing an agreement with the European Union, but at the last minute signed an economic partnership with Russia that had more favorable terms. Now, this led to the outbreak of what was known as the Maidan protests, named after a square in central Kiev called Maidan Square. It's now called Freedom Square. At the forefront of this were activists and NGOs who were funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a well-known CIA front, and US aid, likewise a kind of US intelligence cutout. But there was also a significant representation of excuse me, sorry, there was a significant quotient of people at the forefront of this who were a kind of rabid, violent ultranationalists who sought total severance of Ukraine from Russia in every way. This carried on the clashes throughout Ukraine between pro and anti-Maidan activists kind of steadily escalated from November onwards, and this culminated in February 2014 with a massacre of Maidan protesters and also police officers in Maidan Square. This was blamed on Russia slash the Ukrainian government, and it led to the ouster of Yankovic, who then fled the country. Subsequent to this, we have a leaked phone call where Victoria Newland effectively handpicked all of the far right figures who would serve in an interim government in Ukraine, and she also notoriously said "F the EU" and referred to how the US was midwifing the revolution in Ukraine.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here. Especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now. So we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think, what in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week.
And this effectively led the south and east of Ukraine to descend into pretty much outright civil war between pro and anti-Maidan factions. Now, a key event in this chaos was the May 2nd Odessa massacre. Odessa is a historically Russian city populated by people who overwhelmingly identified as Russian, spoke Russian, and rejected the Maidan government. On May the 2nd, there was a violent clash between pro and anti-Maidan activists. On the pro side were a significant number of neo-Nazis tied to football hooligan groups who went on to form Azov Battalion, which is this openly neo-Nazi unit within the Ukrainian armed forces and was at the forefront of the civil war in Donbass. Now, May 2nd culminated with a large number of anti-Maidan activists who were fleeing armed and dangerous neo-Nazis, barricading themselves or getting barricaded in a building known as the Trades Unions House in central Odessa, which was then set on fire. 250 people were injured via smoke inhalation. I think it was between 40 and 50 people died, both from, some were burnt alive, others died jumping out of windows trying to escape the blaze. There has been a blame game ever since between Ukraine and its Western backers and Russia as to who or what was responsible. Ukraine held that it was, a tragic accident or perhaps even the fault of anti-Maidan protesters themselves. Now, we fast forward to, I believe it was March 13th, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in a case brought by 28 individuals, 25 of whom lost family and loved ones in the fire, and 3 people who were injured in it, that Ukraine was responsible for what happened and had committed very grave breaches of the European Convention on Human Rights, specifically Article 2, which relates to the right to life. This is a seismic finding which has been completely overlooked by the mainstream media, but it sheds significant light on what happened that fateful day.
So help us understand why this finding is so seismic, as you put it, so relevant. It does feel like there was an expectation, certainly, sorry to drag this all back to an American lens, okay, but there was this expectation, I think, from a lot of Trump voters that he was an anti-war candidate, and that a lot of the evidence of that was his repeated statements that he would end the war in Ukraine. And if I recall correctly, even some statements that seem to sort of acknowledge the role America played in installing pro-NATO leadership in Ukraine in a way that establishment politicians in either party would never admit to. Now that he is president, it does feel like there is a little bit of a shift. People in his base frustrated at escalations in the Middle East, and undermining the idea that he is, in fact, a kind of a pro-war candidate, an anti-war candidate, although some people like Bat-Younger Sargon are still out here really making the case that he is anti-war. But I am curious about how you see any shift, if any, with respect to the situation in Ukraine and what role this revelation may or may not play in that.
Yeah, sure. So, it does tend to make a mockery of the notion that this, yes, all began in February 2022 with an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But more generally, I think the reason that this landmark ruling is being ignored is because it does tend to validate what the Russians were saying all along. I might add that there's another aspect to this which I didn't mention in terms of the historical background. But the Odessa massacre, it may be off the radar of the average US citizen. For Russians who were spectating this, and there's an enormous amount of video material from the day, some of it deeply horrific, openly circulating on YouTube and other video streaming sites. The Russians were very, very worried by this, if not outright horrified, and there was a significant contingent of Russia's population that wanted the Kremlin to do something about this. We can only imagine how, say, dozens of American citizens being burned alive by Mexican nationalists or Canadian nationalists would play with certain quarters of the US population, right? You can add to this that Ukrainian ultranationalists, far from seeing this as as an absolutely horrific loss of life, for years afterwards would joke about the traditional May barbecue. But despite this, the Kremlin refused to act. The largest protests in the history of Putin's rule occurred subsequent to this. They united nationalists, communists, liberals, people of other political persuasions, because there was a widespread feeling within Russian society that the Kremlin was not doing anything, let alone enough, in response to these highly provocative and literally incendiary acts. And I might add as well that the Odessa massacre, it was it ignited further clashes throughout Ukraine. So a week after this, and you can find a British news report from the time, shot on the ground in Mariupol, which is was a city in southern Ukraine and is now claimed by Russia and was fought over rather bitterly at the start of the proxy war. There was a savage crackdown where scores of the Ukrainian soldiers flooded into the city, set fire to the local police station to prevent ammunition and weapons inside falling into the hands of kind of anti-Maidan activists. And ever after, the city was ruled with an iron fist by right sector, Azov, and other Western-backed, fascist paramilitary groups. There was a huge crackdown across Donbass after this, targeting civilians, and it galvanized separatist or kind of pro-Russian or anti-Maidan, whatever you want to call them, elements. There were people who hitherto had been kind of sat idly by, who took up arms because they were extremely worried about what could happen to them. There was it produced an effective civil war that raged with fluctuating intensity for the next 8 years in the east of Ukraine. So, I mean, and all along there was this pressure on the Kremlin to do something about it, and they steadfastly refused. So, I mean, I think that the fact that, that there's notably a few days ago, it was reported that the US had withdrawn from this international legal coalition that was investigating responsibility for the war in Ukraine and purported Russian war crimes that was set up by the British in 2022. I mean, it's a small data point, but it does tend to suggest that the US is stepping back from this, and actually there is a bit more nuance in government circles about ultimate responsibility for this happening, and they're not, and the power structure isn't entirely devoted to this fiction that this was completely unprovoked and an act of belligerence by this kind of Hitler 2.0 in Moscow. And we've also had a recent talk between Putin and Trump. Hitherto, of course, under Biden, all formal diplomatic channels were put on hold between Moscow and Washington. So, I mean, that is a potentially positive and an encouraging sign. Although, because people have been so hyped up on this Ukraine derangement syndrome, there is significant pushback against any discussions whatsoever or a negotiated settlement, particularly in Europe.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is this report validates it undermines the number one Trump derangement talking point that this was unprovoked, and two, it validates some of the concerns that leftists and others have had about who constitutes the pro-Maidan faction and why the United States is so sort of unequivocally and without any nuance or pause willing to arm pro-Nazi groups. And so to that end, I see how it's validating and affirming. I'm curious what you make of the now sort of dated, but we never talked about it on this podcast, sit down between Donald Trump and Zelensky. And I'm curious in part because while this EU human rights report is affirming of this sort of anti-derangement perspective, the fact that Donald Trump, for better or for worse, has become sort of the face of that has made many in the mainstream unwilling to interpret this point of view as anything other than sort of Putin apologia. And so that being said, I wonder what your analysis was of the, infamously contentious White House meeting between the two of them a couple of weeks ago. More than just the two of them. J.D. Vance played an outsized role, as I'm sure we can all remember. We'll insert a clip.
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you are
Mr.
not
President,
strong...
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the President for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Come once.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military?
We have problems.
And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems. Even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless.
You don't
God
know
bless.
that.
You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because
I'm
you're in no
answering on
position
this
to
question.
dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly
this.
what
I'm not
You're
dictating.
in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war,
You're not
Mr.
in a
Brown,
good position. You don't have the
in
cards right now. With us, you start having
not playing
cards.
cards.
But right now, you
I'm
don't.
very
You're playing
serious,
cards.
Mr. President.
You're
I'm
playing
very
cards.
serious.
You're gambling
I'm the
with the
president
lives
in
of
war.
millions of people.
You think-
You're gambling with World War III.
What are you
You're
thinking about?
gambling with
What are you
World
thinking
War
about?
III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. It's
with
back
all
to you.
respect to your
Far
country.
more than a lot of people said
very
they
respect.
should have.
Have you said thank you once?
A lot
entire
of
meeting?
times.
No, in this
Even
entire meeting,
today.
have you said thank
Even
you?
today.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's not. I mean, it was a pretty catastrophic summit by all accounts, and I think that what was interesting was again the European reaction to this, where there was an elite British government tied defense quote unquote think tank called Chatham House. One of their representatives went on Bloomberg in the wake of this meeting and said, well, this shows that NATO is dead and that we can't rely on the US anymore. And then minutes later, he acknowledged, well, actually, we do have to rely on the US because we have no independent weapon manufacturing capability, anything like the Americas. So, I mean, yeah, it is very difficult to make of, to know what to make of Trump's position on this. It does seem to shift almost daily. It has been said of the Oval Office resident that his position reflects the last conversation he had. So he has variously slammed Zelensky. He has slammed Putin. He has suggested that the US is going to pull back from this. He suggested the US will become further involved in this. It is very difficult to know excuse me, where his position actually lies. Although I do think that the recent bombing of Yemen, which is scheduled to last for several weeks at the very least, and indeed is being framed as an anti-Iran action, and that any escalation in response from the Ansar Allah, derisively known as the Houthis in Yemen, will be seen as an escalation by Iran. Whether the war machine's focus is simply shifting elsewhere. I mean, I might add that in July last year, RAND, which is this kind of Pentagon-funded think tank, it produced a little-noticed report that effectively stated that the US doesn't have the stockpiles or the defense industrial base necessary to keep the Ukraine war going. So there are, more material concerns beyond peace for peace's sake that might lie behind any Trump administration push to end this. But yeah, I mean, again, the silver lining in this is that I don't think, and there are open source indications that there just simply isn't the ammunition or vehicles or weaponry or artillery left in the tank to sustain this any longer. I mean, Russian military production outstrips all of NATO put together. I mean, they can make millions of shells annually. The US is struggling to make tens of thousands, and several thousand are fired daily on the fields of Donbass by both sides. And there was, of course, in the wake of that White House meeting, a temporary pause on military support and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, which may have led to the collapse of Ukraine's Kursk incursion, which was launched with much fanfare last summer. And now Ukrainian forces are retreating, leaving behind all sorts of expensive Western military equipment, and with potentially tens of thousands of casualties to show for all of their efforts. Again, the future seems like highly uncertain. This may well be by design. Trump does like to keep people guessing, but then is also, easily influenced. At the same time, the European commitment to keeping this going seems to depend on, buying weapons from whoever still has any left, which is, a vanishingly small number of countries that have any military production capacity whatsoever, and also all sorts of fantasies about maybe deploying peacekeepers to Ukraine, or maybe a air defense force, which would be seen. I mean, Russian officials have openly said would be viewed as an escalation and would make the countries involved, particularly Britain and France, who seem to be doggedly pursuing this, active belligerence in the war. So, I mean, there's also that impasse, which there's no obvious resolution to for the people who want to keep this going.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Okay, so for one, I have also seen the reporting that America's military stockpile is low, and I accept that as a potential motivation behind Trump's position in Ukraine. Except for that, Biden ostensibly was in the same situation and showed no similar desire to back off of his support for Ukraine. And additionally, I am sort of confused as to how it can be the case that Russia dramatically outstrips America's ability to produce arms, just given how much money we as a country spend on defense. Famously, the stat is 10 times as much as more than the next 10 countries spending combined. So what is going on there? And do you really believe that the weapons stockpile limitation is what's driving Donald Trump, since that seems to have been a somewhat longstanding issue that should have ostensibly affected Biden's calculus similarly, unless there was some other ideological or political rationale at work?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think that the war in Ukraine is it is unique in terms of modern warfare, in terms of how it's being fought. So, I mean, there were several rather amusing testimonies from American or Western mercs who traveled to Ukraine, being veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, and then ran away very quickly because they were used to fighting farmers in Afghanistan who are armed with AK-47s, with air cover. They didn't have any of that in Ukraine. And it is a grinding attritional battle where they're just, both sides are just relentlessly firing drones and artillery at each other, often across, empty fields spanning, hundreds of kilometers, from one side to the other. There's very little kind of direct, infantry fighting and whatnot, unlike previous conflicts. There was a report by RUSI, which is again a kind of British government affiliated defense think tank. I believe it was last summer, which stated that, well, the West is really not prepared for the kind of war that is currently transpiring in Donbass, because for many, many years, the US has invested exorbitant amounts of money in a global military machine, which is explicitly and exclusively suited to one-side gang batterings of defenseless adversaries. Like it's been rather memory hold now, but at the end of 2023, with some fanfare, there was this grand US naval flotilla sent to the Red Sea. It was dubbed Operation Prosperity Guardian, and their purpose was to crush Ansarallah's blockade of the Red Sea. And very, very quickly, they ran into the problem that, well, the Houthis were just blasting them with drones costing like $20. And the U.S. Navy and Air Force were shooting them down with missiles costing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. So it's like the type of wars that America's military, and indeed its kind of military industry has been crafted to fight does not reflect the realities of modern warfare. There was a remarkable association when Operation Prosperity Guardian ended, having achieved no tangible results whatsoever last June, and the USS Eisenhower rushed back to base in the US. There was an Associated Press report which interviewed many pilots and US sailors who were very traumatized by the experience of their Red Sea deployment, and one said, "Well, we're not really used to being shot at." It's like so. I mean, this is there's the US has not fought a kind of peer war, PWER, not peer in the aid sense, like they failed to construct in Gaza, since like Korea. So you're going back decades and decades and decades. The Iraq War, Iraq basically didn't have a military. The country had been completely crushed by sanctions. It was effectively defenseless, and even that was an unwinnable quagmire. After the fall of Saddam's government, there was a very lengthy insurgency afterwards, and the US ended up just leaving, or did they? They left some military presence, but they formally withdrew. Likewise in Afghanistan, where you had 20 years of occupation, and the CIA and Pentagon constructed intelligence agencies and a military, a very well-armed one, for the puppet government in Kabul, and then it fell within a few hours of the US leaving. So I mean that's where the disparity comes from, and I think that that Russia has the resources just in its own soil to just keep building things at an enormous pace and scale that other countries can't match. And I might add that the problems are compounded from Europe's perspective by the fact that the European countries went along with the anti-Russian sanctions and therefore cut themselves off from cheap Russian energy, which was the basis of their industry. There have been a large number of reports in the Western media that testify to the fact that Europe is effectively deindustrialized at this point, because it's just exorbitantly expensive to get energy from elsewhere. I mean, in some cases they buy oil and gas from the US. In other cases, they buy Russian oil and gas from a reseller, with a marked up price. So they've painted themselves into a corner there. And also there's just the fact, as again, the US focusing on creating this military machine that is suited to one-sided what's the word? One-sided gang beatings of enemies that can't fight back. This has flooded throughout. This kind of doctrine has flooded throughout NATO. There is an enormous focus on air power when as the Saudi Arabia's kind of almost 10-year-long air war on Yemen demonstrated, that or indeed say Israel's assault on Gaza demonstrates, air power is very good for killing civilians and destroying civilian infrastructure indiscriminately. It's not effective at winning actual wars. There was a report in Foreign Affairs, which is it's published by the Council of Foreign Relations, this very influential DC foreign policy body, that at the end of last year, which concluded that Hamas was beating the Israeli occupation forces because any time that Israel sent ground forces into Gaza, Hamas made effective use of camouflage, tunnels, and all sorts to fight back against them. So they had to rely on just carpet bombing the place, which again, it killed a lot of people, primarily women and children, but it left Hamas completely unscathed. Likewise, Israel's incursion into Lebanon in October last year, it destroyed a lot of residential apartment blocks, and it killed a lot of innocent people. It didn't scratch Hezbollah. Despite all this, there does seem some kind of commitment to ramping up for a major conflict, despite cognizance that it can't be won. Lawrence Wilkerson, who's this, I believe he was Colin Powell's advisor, and he's a military veteran himself. He stated that while he served in the Bush administration, there were multiple war games exercises which envisioned a conflict with China, and it found that, over and over again, it was found that the US would, in a fight with China, be effectively defeated within days and then have to go nuclear. But they're still ramping up the rhetoric against China and preparing for war in the Pacific.
You can't beat a billion people.
Yeah,
you can't beat indeed. A billion people. I can count. I'm not a war strategist. But I know that a billion is 3 times more than 300 million, which is what we have. Okay. All right. Where are we in game wise with Russia, Ukraine? Trump obviously promised to bring this war to a close. Where do we stand with respect to these negotiations? I also want to give you a chance to speak to this new clip from Boris Johnson, in which, Aaron Monte identified some kind of new admissions. Basically, they're now willing to acknowledge Zelensky's role and the West's role in holding up negotiations within months of Russia invading in the first place.
You got to remember that Volodymyr Zelensky is he's not an unreasonable guy. He got elected really as a peacenik. He was out that, 2019, he tried to do a deal with Putin. As far as I can remember, his basic problem was that the Ukrainian nationalists couldn't accept the compromise, and you can see why not.
Yeah, sure. So, I think that clip's very interesting for a variety of reasons. So, it must be remembered that Zelensky was elected in April 2019 via a landslide. He won 73% of the vote to the incumbent far right Poroshenko's 25%. Zelensky was the reason for his vast margin of victory was because he stood on an explicit platform of ending the war in the Donbass and restoring relations with Russia. And there was an enormous number of Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the south and the east who voted for him on that basis. Now, initially, when Zelensky, after Zelensky came to power, he moved to hold a national referendum on granting special status to the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, as they styled themselves, and they are now claimed as Russian territory by Moscow. But there were ultra-nationalist protests against this in Kiev, which kind of put that on the back burner. Zelensky himself, and you can find videos of this rather tragic incident, he went to meet with Azov fighters on the front line in Donbass personally, and begged them to lay down their arms and accept a compromise. They laughed in his face and threatened him basically. So, I mean, yes, as Boris Johnson correctly says, it was these nationalists in Ukraine that put that on ice. What Boris Johnson doesn't mention is that subsequent to this, in March 2021, Zelensky signed a presidential decree on the recapture of temporarily occupied territory in Donbass and Crimea, which effectively called for seizing these areas via military force, and was an effective blueprint for all-out war. Resultantly, Ukrainian forces began massing in the south and the east in the country, which in turn led to Russia's military buildup on its border with Ukraine. And this is when you suddenly start hearing in the media all of these claims that, oh, well, Russia's about to invade Ukraine, Russia's about to invade, Russia's about to invade. Without any reference to the fact that their presence was explicitly in response to Ukraine's own escalation. I think that Zelensky was also talking about a desire to obtain nuclear weapons at this time. Despite this, until the 11th hour, there were meetings between Russian and Ukrainian officials on implementing Minsk, which would grant the Donbass kind of limited autonomy within Ukraine, but they kept on coming to nothing. What really was the spark that ignited the proxy war decisively was in mid-February 2022. Ukrainian forces began mass shelling the Donbass. Now, whether this was a precursor to a ground offensive by Kiev to recapture these territories or a trap to kind of lure Russian forces into invading is a matter of interpretation. Of course, the Biden administration had made very clear what the consequences for Russia invading would be at that stage. Like all of these sanctions, which were meant to make the ruble rubble, haven't done that since they were implemented. But yeah, that led to the formal recognition of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics by Russia after a formal request from Russia's Duma, their parliament or Congress, and then yes, the formal deployment of Russian forces to Ukraine on the 24th. But another thing that Johnson doesn't mention is the fact that there were conducive and fruitful peace negotiations ongoing between Russia and Ukraine from February 2022 until I believe it was May of that year, which he personally sabotaged. The details of that agreement have been released and confirmed by the Western media. It would have left the Donbass part of Ukraine. They would have had autonomy. Ukraine would have accepted military neutrality, would have been free to pursue EU membership, but would have had strict limits on the size of its armed forces and a total prohibition on Western weapon systems on its territory. They were a signature away from being signed when Boris Johnson flew to Kiev and offered Zelensky the blankest of blank checks to keep fighting, which sabotaged the negotiations, and then subsequently a law was passed by the Ukraine's Rada, their parliament, prohibiting any further negotiations with Russia. So, I mean, for all of his talk about how Zelensky's a reasonable guy, well, I mean, that might have been the case until Johnson himself encouraged Zelensky to just to keep going. It's interesting that he omits his own personal role in all this. But I think that we are so far away from, any future peace agreement, and I think that there are some other encouraging signs that the Ukrainians are getting realistic about the necessity of signing some kind of deal with the Russians. The terms are going to be far harsher than were agreed in May 2022. In the lead up to Trump's call with Putin recently, the New York Times reported that the Ukrainian officials were terrified that more territory, including, ironically enough, Odessa, might be given to the Russians in a US brokered peace deal. There is actually a historical precedent for this, which I have noted many times since this nightmare began, which is the war in Bosnia in the mid '90s, where the US was backing the Bosniak, which is to say Slavic Muslim side in a civil war in Bosnia. They consistently encouraged the Bosniaks to reject negotiations, not make concessions, reject various peace deals that were brokered by the UN and the European Union. And then at the last minute, they turned around and forced a highly inequitable peace on their Bosniak proxies, which was far worse than any previous peace deal that they'd rejected with US encouragement. And under the terms of that deal, it's known as the Dayton Agreement, the Bosniaks had to sign over considerably more territory to the Serbs with whom they were at war. So, I mean, yeah, there is a clear precedent for exactly this
why?
happening.
I mean, can I just ask, I'm sorry if this is, parochial, but what's the point? So I can understand from Zelensky's point of view, let's say in his heart of hearts, he wanted a settlement. He was the peace president. He was happy to, he's a Jewish man who maybe isn't quite so fond of the Azov battalion and those ultranationalists himself. He's fine, let these ethnic Russians have this kind of intermediate status, some kind of self-determination, no skin off my back. I'm just an actor who failed up. Then here comes the United States saying, and the UK and NATO saying, okay, we're going to give you this blank check. We've got your back. You don't have to bend the knee to Russia. You can fight all out, and we've got the biggest military in the world at your back. So he's like, okay, fine, bet. I have some pride. I don't want to have to give things away to Russia if I don't want to. So we're going to fight this under these conditions. And then the rug is pulled out from under you. And now the United States is reneging on the deal in the same way that you described in Bosnia. And at a certain point, after you've lost how many tens, hundreds of thousands of people, you feel like it's a sunk cost. Now it's a fallacy, but you feel like it's a sunk, you're in it for the long run.
No, in for a penny, in for a pound.
In for a penny, in for a pound. And so, psychologically, this is not a moral assessment, but just a psychological assessment. You can kind of understand even Zelensky's, what might be the root of his anger in a meeting like that. You schmucks told me to do this, and now after I've lost so much, you're reneging on the deal. And with that posture, if that's sort of the underlying posture of this all, how do you come to a resolution? Is this gonna just be Ukraine has to suffer America's voracious appetite for war? It's not exactly clear to me, and I would love for you to help me understand what America has constructively gotten out of this. Yes, it's a proxy war. The idea was we're going to turn the ruble into rubble. Russia was supposed to be hurting mightily. Doesn't seem to have been the case. It seems to have further driven all of these other global growing power centers to want to bricks it up and make other kinds of alliances, hastened on, the fall of Rome and the American Empire. Exposed NATO as vulnerable and so overly reliant in the United States of America and basically a sitting duck, subject to the whims of a fickle president. Stepping back for a second to the kind of geopolitical stakes, this feels supremely messy. And it's not clear to me what the upside ultimately has been for any of the parties involved, except for maybe some, weapons manufacturer who's profiting off of making these bombs.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, wars are interesting things. I mean, I think it was Trotsky who said that the wars are what oil the wheels of history. I mean, you got to bear in mind that, like World War One, which was expected to last a few months, ended up lasting 4 years, led to the destruction of 4 empires, the creation of the Soviet Union, the creation of Yugoslavia. It brought capitalism to its knees, and decimated the population of most Western European countries. They always have unintended consequences. I mean, I think, and this is a point that I've made before, is that the US can pull back from this because it does still have significant internal wealth. It has an entire backyard to rough up and knock back into line. We have seen the emergence of a number of popular left-wing governments, which many across the region, which Washington is no doubt extremely unhappy about. But they can emerge from this relatively unscathed, and Europe, as we've discussed, it remains ultimately financially and militarily dependent on the US. It doesn't have any degree of autonomy at all.
Deal.
I mean,
it's a weird thing in retrospect. I know hindsight's 2020, but it's a weird deal to have accepted in retrospect.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think this is another reason why, the sunk cost fallacy, it applies to Europe as well, because they've disarmed themselves by sending all of their equipment to Ukraine, and so it's just it's at this point, it's like, well, you break it, you bought it. It's like this determination just to not take the L, and to just not accept defeat because they've invested so much in this. And it's, there are so much of the rhetoric about, well, we'll support Ukraine as long as it takes. This is a grand battle for European values and democracy against fascism or autocracy or despotism or whatnot. It's quite difficult to row back from that, and then one day just say, oh, actually, it's no big deal. I also think as well, and this is where funnily enough, another parallel with Bosnia comes in, is that you would have to be a moron not to, and of which there are plenty within the Western power structure, of course, but that you would have to be a moron to not understand that there's going to be significant blowback if there is a withdrawal of support for Ukraine, because already it's quite clear that Ukrainian leaders themselves and their supporters in the Western media and political class are constructing a stab in the back myth, like this notion of betrayal, and that can lead to very grave consequences. Now, there is
Ukraine was betrayed by the West's false promises.
Yeah, and they told us they'd help us win, and then. But
you call it a myth, but is that not what happened? I mean, like, the merits of it aside, is that not what happened? Was Ukraine not induced, constructively induced with these promises into taking one course of action that it initially wasn't going to take?
Yeah. Well, no, absolutely, and that's the. I mean, such is the fate of so many U.S. proxies. Is that yes, that they were. I mean, in 2017, Lindsey Graham and John McCain visited the Azov fighters and said, your fight is our fight, and like they were pumping them up to go after Russia proper.
I admire the fact that you will fight for your homeland. Your fight is our fight. 2017 will be the year of offense. All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
Ми всі повернемося до Вашингтону і ми будемо відстоювати санкції проти Росії.
Enough of a Russian aggression.
Досить вже російської агресії.
It is time for them to pay a heavier price.
Час вже, щоб вони заплатили важчу ціну.
Our fight is not with the Russian people, but with Putin.
Ми боремося не з російським народом, але з Путіним.
Our promise to you is to take your cause to Washington
Наша обіцянка – це те, що ми вашу боротьбу доведемо до Вашингтона.
Inform the American people of your bravery.
Проінформуємо американський народ про вашу відважність.
And make the case against Putin to the world.
І покажемо про докази проти Путіна усьому світу.
I believe you will win. I am convinced you will win, and we will do everything we can to provide you with what you need to win.
Я вірю в те, що ви виграєте, переможете. Я переконаний в тому, що ви переможете, і ми вам допоможемо всіма можливими засобами.
And we have succeeded not because of equipment, but because of your courage.
Ви успішні не через обладнання, але через вашу відважність.
So I thank you, and the world is watching. And the world is watching because we cannot allow Vladimir Putin to succeed here. Because if he succeeds here, he will succeed in other countries.
Я вам дуже дякую. І весь світ за цим слідкує. І весь світ за цим слідкує, тому що ми не можемо дозволити Володимиру Путіну тут перемогти. Адже якщо він тут переможе, він зможе це зробити і в інших країнах.
With Ukraine, with the civil war in Donbass just being a beachhead for that. You know, I mean, another reason that Russia was averse to getting drawn into this, because they understood that it was intended to spark something much larger. They do have legitimate grounds for claiming they were betrayed based on what was promised versus the reality of what actually was inevitably going to happen. But it's like when you have a large number of people in Ukraine who are battle hardened, have ready access to weapons, and are probably psychologically scarred to an extreme degree by what they've suffered and seen. War is an absolutely horrific thing, and so if and when the day comes that the US turns its back on Ukraine, so to speak, or pulls the rug out from Ukraine's feet, there's going to be a large number of people, particularly with a preponderantly large number of people who have extremist political views, who are going to be extremely angry and are going to want to take revenge. At the GrayZone, we have been reporting almost since the very start of this on how there have been Western neo-Nazi groups with ties to Azov who have been caught by authorities in countries like Italy, but also the US, plotting mass casualty attacks. And I think that risk. Sorry, go ahead.
On whom do they want to take revenge? They're going to just personally start a war with Russia, or they are going to fight other Ukrainians who want peace? Like, against whom?
Well, against the powers that quote unquote allowed their defeat to happen, and I think that to give you an example, like Robert Fico, who he's the leader of Slovakia. He was elected by a significant margin at the end of 2023 on an explicit platform of ending Slovakia's support for the war in Ukraine and ending the sanctions on Russia. Last year, he got shot, and it is quite clear that any withdrawal of support would be seen as a betrayal by the countries responsible. Yes, Robert Fico got shot last year by a Ukraine supporter, but explicitly because of his cessation of support for the war. It is unclear whether his shooter had international connections and was perhaps pushed into doing what he did. And this is before the war's even over. Now, the parallel with Bosnia to draw is during that conflict, the CIA shipped into Bosnia a large number of Mujahideen fighters from places like Afghanistan and Egypt to fight against the Bosnian Serbs. Now, at the very end of the conflict, under the terms of Dayton, they were forced to leave the country, and they were explicitly forced out, and their leaders were assassinated to kind of create this hostile environment for them in the country. Now, several of them, in attempting to flee, got caught at borders by the CIA and shipped back to their countries of origin, where they stood trial for very serious terror offences. This was seen by their leadership, which included Osama bin Laden, as a betrayal by America, and it produced Al-Qaeda's jihad against the US, which one way or another leads to 9/11. And several of the 9/11 hijackers were veterans of the war in Bosnia. So I do think that there's probably an element of European thinking that, well, if we cut aid for Ukraine, they're on our doorstep, and there are many living amongst us. There are refugees who moved here. They might not respond very well to this. And I think this was an overt threat that Zelensky made in an interview with The Economist, where he said, well, so far Ukrainians have been living in Europe, have been very hospitable guests. They might not be if you throw us under the bus, which was like a pretty sinister thing. Like a pretty sinister thing to say, but it reflects a very real prospect. There was at the start of 2023, there was the British Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee. It produced a report, heavily redacted, but you can fill in the blanks very easily, where it said there's a large number of people who are returning from the war in Ukraine who might have extremist connections and may have access to weapons. There is currently no system in place for monitoring them and ensuring that they don't get up to no good, whether in the UK or elsewhere. Subsequent to this, there were some ultra-nationalist French mercenaries who were caught in Paris with large amounts of ammunition and weapons. I mean, use your imagination for what they were planning to do with that. So, I mean, all the more reason to keep this grinding on, despite the completely unsustainable economic, military, and human cost.
Okay, so I understand what you're saying about where was it that the elected leader was shot who wanted to end the support for Ukraine?
Slovakia.
In Slovakia. I can understand the dynamics there. It's harder for me to understand. I mean, I can understand why someone in a different country would want to continue to give support. That's obviously the position that so many Americans are in. But also, we're not suffering any of the consequences of it. It is more difficult for me to understand what the dynamics are internally in Ukraine when it seemed obvious from day one of this that it was going to end only one way, because you can't go up against a nuclear power and think you're going to win. That's just not how it works. When you follow the path of escalation, you're being backed, okay, by another nuclear power in the United States, but who is ostensibly, hopefully, disinterested in having actual nuclear engagement, which is why we don't have the air support that would be perceived as escalatory, which is why it can't be won without said air support, and why you're in this holding pattern that Ukrainians are paying for with their lives. So if I am, let's say I am an ultranationalist, for the sake of this argument, like what is actually the end game? Are they just nihilists? I don't understand. Like, how do they see this playing out? They want us to go to nuclear war, or they think that they can just truck through on their own? What is the thinking? What is their conception of an end game?
I find it difficult to cosplay as an ultranationalist because I'm
sure.
very much not that. But it's like,
not a Nazi.
I do think that there was an expectation that this would lead to direct Western involvement, and that this was probably what was being drilled into their heads by their British and American trainers and handlers. Because you got to bear in mind that there are many of these fascist neo-Nazi paramilitary groups. They were trained at like elite British and American military academies and stuff, and moreover, Britain, which has been a very key advocate of using Ukraine as a beachhead to finally balkanize Russia and overthrow the Tsar, since the Maidan coup, they since the very start of this, and this is reflected in reporting on a large number of leaks that we've received at the GrayZone. They've been pushing for ever greater escalation and constantly trying to ramp things up to the point of direct, overt, unabashed Western involvement in the fighting. The Kursk suicide mission, which I mentioned earlier, this was cooked up by Britain, and it was openly reported in the Times of London that the purpose was to try and normalize overt Western involvement in the war, because Britain provided an enormous amount of equipment for this, and they planned it, and they British officials were boasting in the media, this is the first time that British tanks have ever been on Russian territory, and the Times said this was a deliberate strategy that it was hoped that the US and Germany and France would emulate. That is World War III in everything but name. But it was never going to happen because, as deranged and seeming misguided as a lot of people in the Biden administration were, I think that there were still people possessed of cooler heads who, as you say, understand, well, we're at war. That would be war with a nuclear power, which would mean nuclear war. And that's something that we actually want to avoid. And it's also just a fact as well that, just for all of the mainstream media narrativizing about how this has been an embarrassment for Russia and how their armed forces are a paper tiger, they have used a tiny fraction of their military capabilities on this. The euphemism special military operation, that is a euphemism, but it's from Russia's perspective, this is not war yet. Like, they haven't flattened Kiev, even though that is well within their capabilities. Russia possesses hypersonic and ballistic missiles, which can't be shot down by Western air defense systems. But they haven't done that. We haven't seen the horrifying scenes that have emanated from Gaza in Ukraine at all. Indeed, there were some mainstream, I believe it was the Washington Post, that stated that the US officials were quote unquote baffled by how gentle Russia had been. Their entire focus has not been on trying to terrorize the civilian population or destroy civilian infrastructure. Their focus has been entirely on military installations, in service of demilitarizing Ukraine. A very clearly stated objective. And I might add that, yes, that again, a somewhat encouraging sign, although we are in a constant state of informational flux on the war in Ukraine. After that aforementioned catastrophe in the Oval Office, where J.D. Vance and Trump gave Zelensky a very firm talking to and told him that he had no cards at all. Initially, Zelensky was defiant and said, "We will not accept any loss of territory. We will make no concessions, and we will never accept the oblasts that Russia has annexed as Russian territory." And then within the past few days, it's been reported that his position has shifted to, well, we won't accept any further territorial concessions, which is a small but kind of substantive shift in I guess you could call it a positive direction. Yeah, yeah.
That's like the whole kit and caboodle. That's like, okay, I'm willing to call truce right now and accept my losses. To not be in for a penny, in for a pound. To not do the sunk cost fallacy. That's a huge shift. So then what now? What do you do with that? Does that mean, I mean, if he's willing to accept the territorial losses that have happened to date, which, to be clear, are much greater than if they would have accepted it back a few months after the invasion in the first place, then how close that feels like they're on the path to wrapping this up. What's the obstacle?
Yeah, I mean, the obstacle is how you would police, like, you know, any kind of peace settlement, and I think it's also, as well as another key obstacle to this, is that Russia is advancing everywhere, and they don't have very much in the way of rationale or grounds to stop. You know, I mean, I think that they would charge a very hard bargain in terms of what they would demand in return for stopping, and then that could in itself include, yes, further territorial concessions, the cessation of sanctions, and whatnot. I mean, like I said it was a small shift. You said it was a big one. Then I think that's accurate. It is a major shift from this kind of maximalist position that Zelensky has held throughout the conflict and has been encouraged in. In a few weeks' time, perhaps his red lines will draw back even further, and it's like, well, at least let us keep Kiev. So I mean, we shall see. But yes, I think that the key stumbling block from the West perspective is, well, even if we get Russia to accept some kind of ceasefire, which, you know, isn't just an attempt to try and, you know, regroup and rearm and give Ukraine some breathing space, because it's been very much on the defensive for, you know, well over a year now, with, you know, their manpower and ammunition issues are ever worsening. On top of that, yes, it's like, how do you police that? And like I said, there have been these completely ludicrous proposals for deploying European peacekeeping forces. You know, Russia won't accept that if it's a formal NATO deployment. The suggestion, I think it was called Sky Shield, which was signed off by none other than Malcolm Nance and Adam Kinzinger, this notion that Western jets could patrol the skies of Ukraine and ensure that shoot down Russian missiles and ensure that Russian forces didn't get too close to the Ukrainian capital. These are both kind of non-starters. So, and there's also the issue as well that it's very clear that the UK and France, who want to take the lead on deploying peacekeepers to Ukraine, they don't really have the capabilities to do it. They don't have the people. They don't have the military resources. There was a war game a few years back in which Britain mapped out various scenarios in which they fought an enemy on their home turf, and they found they ran out of ammunition within weeks. So it's like, it's difficult to know what possible terms could be achieved, and this is not helped by European leaders taking a very, very hawkish line. Kaja Kallas, who is the current EU defense chief, she's the former Prime Minister of Estonia and was a rabid anti-Russia hawk, is a rabid anti-Russia hawk of some standing. She's stating, well, we need to defeat Russia, and if we can't, then how are we going to defeat China? Which is, again, is a completely insane position to take. Macron has said that, well, we won't accept demilitarization of Ukraine. So that is, again, it creates this further impasse between, Russia's demand, which they are well placed to make, that Ukraine does not have a serious military force, capable of harming Russia. I mean, the Kursk the Kursk incursion actually cut to the core of Russia's security concerns, because it has a border with Ukraine running to thousands of kilometers, which is complete flatland, and with no natural defenses. It's impossible to ensure, concretely defend every single inch of it all at once, and it is the typical invasion route of when various powers throughout history have attempted to invade Russia. It was here that Napoleon and the Nazis, and also the British and the French in 1917 invaded Russia. It was via Ukraine. So it is a very sticky situation. It's not going to be solved by not talking to Russia, as hitherto European powers and the Ukrainians have avoided doing. Zelensky did this whole tour of peace summits, which didn't include Russia at all, and the typical response of international attendees, those who actually bothered turning up, was, well, you need to include Russia in this. So again, that chat, the 2-hour or however long it was telephone call between Trump and Putin could be a step in the right direction. But again, as we've discussed, so many people have so much invested in this that it would be very difficult to spin a peace on Russia's terms as anything other than a defeat. And I don't think that they're willing to accept that yet.
It's gonna be a defeat if the West's posture is, if I didn't destroy Russia, I didn't win. If the posture, what's so crazy about this, why I'm getting so triggered as we come up on the end of this conversation, is that, do you remember that point in time? I don't remember exactly when it was, maybe like a year and a half ago or so, where the media narrative was all about Putin had made this speech about allegedly how he wanted to conquer all of Europe, and how he was hearkening back to some classic Russian lore or something about how he had these imperial ambitions. He wanted to restore Greater Russia or whatever it was. Do you remember this? And so everyone was hand-wringing about how we have to fight Ukraine, we have to weaken Russia, because Russia's not going to stop at Ukraine. Everything that you have said, every word out of the West mouth, every time they sit down and get recorded at one of these international conferences, they say something that is explicit. I can't speak Russian, so I don't know what Putin said. I heard some people pushing back against the narrative framing of that, but that's for them to do, not for me. What I can hear very loudly in English is any number of Western actors explicitly saying, as you've just recounted, how are we going to beat China? How are we going to beat Russia? How are we going to weaken Russia? How are we going to beat China? And those aren't framed as imperial ambitions. And this whole thing, let us not lose sight of, is because there was a battle between whether Ukraine was going to go the way of the West and NATO and austerity and IMF shenanigans, or the way of Russia, which they perceived to be a better deal. Again, not an economist, not personally weighing in, but that then we have Victoria Nuland handing out cookies and doing a coup to prevent the people of Ukraine from ostensibly making a democratic choice about their economic governance. How long are we going to do this Cold War BS? It's so absurd. It's so absurd. Democrats are willing to lose an election over it, right? That's part of it. I think the Democratic Party still, as much as they're doing this come to Jesus reckoning about we gotta be more, it's the economy stupid or whatever, and Bernie was right. None of them, I haven't heard anybody grapple with the role that sort of, the kind of, the core of America first, which is not being interventionist. That's a significant part of the messaging from Donald Trump. Whether or not it's authentic, of course, There's a different question, but that was such a big part of it. And so, as much as again the left talks about the Democrats being willing to lose the war because of Israel, it is also the case that the right was able to frame themselves as the peace party because of the uniparty's support of Ukraine. And it's just, I don't know, it's exhausting. Europe doesn't have, it never has had enough in it without going elsewhere to grab other things to be as loud and angry and aggressive as it wants to posture itself as being. And in a post-colonial world, you just can't beat your chest the way you used to. I'm sorry, them's the breaks.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that as I mentioned as well, as I think that another problem with this is that the Europeans remain just like completely delusional about their own power, and
this is what I'm saying.
I mean, despite the fact, like I referenced that Chatham House apparatchik who within the span of minutes went from saying we can't rely on the US to saying we have to rely on the US. Like there is this bizarre self-belief, which is, I mean, it's delusional, but it's also like somehow like just like deeply narcissistic that, well, like, we can do these things because we just should be able to. I mean, it's very difficult to explain. And it's like, in my home country of Britain, which, I mean, they've just announced that they're going to start trying to push young people out of work to join the military because people just refuse to enlist. There have been parliamentary reports which find that Britain doesn't have a military worth speaking of. They are considering reducing health requirements for enlistment to allow people with asthma and other serious ailments to join. They have a navy that is rusting, can't shoot at land, aircraft carriers without aircraft to carry, and the media is exploding and comparing the British media is exploding with excitement and comparing Keir Starmer to Winston Churchill because he's announced a increase in Britain's defence spending of 0.5% by 2027. It's just, I mean, it's like unbelievable. It's like a rounding error on an Excel spreadsheet. And this is somehow meant to be really significant. And it's like, I've written for my my website, kitklarenberg.com, shameless plug, that like this is one of the kind of upshots, the dangerous boomerangs of the unipolar world, was that the Europeans were all in on allowing a unipolar world to form because, well, we have this perpetual US defense umbrella, and also we have all these new Eastern European countries joining NATO who can do all the fighting and dying for us. We can kind of outsource responsibility to them, like Delta Airlines moving its call centers to Mumbai or something. And then in the process, they left their own militaries and economies to just rot,
This is what I was saying earlier when I said it's a bad deal. It was a bad deal not to hedge your bets at all. I'm sorry, that's just I'm going to just be an ugly American for a second. Obviously, I hate American empire. I don't think I have to restate my priors. But like, if I didn't, and if I were invested in America, like being number one forever and all of that, like, and there was some plan to say, okay, England's our close ally for all of these years. They have the best navy historically. Let's just let them guard the waters of the world, and America's not gonna really have a navy. We're gonna focus on the other branches of the military. Like, that, just saying it out loud just sounds so dumb. Because obviously now you're beholden to the UK, which might be with you on some things and might be with you on other things, and you're going to be the tail wagged by the dog, at least partially, for the rest of all time. It's a crazy bargain to strike. And I guess, I don't know, what was the upside? Like, Europe gets to have like healthcare and invest in like fast, pretty trains. In America, we are dog shit, but we have the military. Okay, well, you had a good run. Now what?
Indeed, and it's like, I mean, yeah, like, I mean, like I say, like there was clearly absolutely zero consideration for when for if they had rainy days. They were not. It was assumed that this would just occur in perpetuity, and that there would be zero changes to the geopolitical order. And I mean, this,
which is crazy,
as we kind of touched upon,
which is crazy, maybe a little bit.
Sorry.
Viewers, like, I don't want to say this. I have no. It feels a little awesome supremacist. Like, you really it never occurred to anybody that anyone else would rise up. Like, you were that confident in your own like superiority that you never foresaw this day coming. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, but I mean, yes, it's completely. I mean, I think that there's a very interesting book. I irritatingly can't remember the author, but it's called Covenants Without Swords, and it's about the kind of the British Empire during the 1930s, when at least in terms of its size, the British Empire had reached formally it was at its biggest, and it encompassed almost a quarter of the globe was under direct British rule. But Britain, because it believed it was this unchallengeable global hegemon, like the US is now, that it could enter into all of these defense agreements with smaller countries, and it could try and resolve issues like the growing war between Zionist settlers and Palestinians in mandatory Palestine. And it didn't actually have the wealth or the muscle to back any of this up. I mean, and this is what directly led to World War II. Was the British were fatally overstretched. They couldn't see it, but their adversaries in Japan and Germany could. Like the British believed themselves to be invincible when they really, really, really weren't. And I mean, I mentioned that RAND report from last year. It was an appraisal of the Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy. And that document made all sorts of bombastic claims about America's unparalleled and unchallengeable economic and military position in the world. And it didn't reference the fact that at the start of 2022, China and Russia signed this no limits partnership, which in a way created a completely new world. And as you mentioned, the war in Ukraine has sped up the pace of de-dollarization. It has emboldened BRICS. It's created all sorts of new economic, political and military alliances. The Russia, China, but also Iran and North Korea and a growing number of countries are joined at the hip in all of these areas. And war with one of them would mean war with them all, and the US wouldn't win it. I mean, let alone Europe with its non-existent armies and economies based on services and all sorts of other pointless industries. It's farce, but it's also frightening because the people in charge don't seem to have caught up with this reality. And as I mentioned with Britain, Keir Starmer is issuing all these bombastic statements about London's readiness to bankroll Ukraine in perpetuity to the tune of billions. Meanwhile, the average living standards are collapsing, prices are ever skyrocketing. Its population is collapsing as people flee elsewhere, and there are openly both current and former military chiefs who are saying that Britain doesn't have the capabilities to seriously mount any kind of operation for any length of time in Ukraine, because it just doesn't have the soldiers or the weaponry to do it.
Watch out! They're gonna cut healthcare and raise the cost of education and force people into the military. That's how they do.
Yeah,
that's how we have a military.
Literally. you're literally doing it. Yeah, no. So I mean, yes. Again, as I say, a kind of an extremely farcical state of affairs, but also a tragic one with an enormous scope for catastrophe and disaster.
Yeah. I think what's been frustrating about, I mean, I don't want to repeat myself. It just, from day one, I remember there was like a lefty event immediately, like very shortly after the invasion that had like a lot of, Joe Cicerone was there. A bunch of journalists, local DC journalists and stuff were there from the lefty places. Adam Coburn was there, like people were there. And there was this discussion about what to do about Ukraine, like what was supposed to happen. And this was like an ostensibly like a lefty room. And it became clear to me immediately that even in this space, any acknowledgement that Ukraine might cede to any territory, like 1 inch, was being framed, not by everyone in the room, but by some loud folks in the room, as like championing Ukraine's surrender and defeat. But also, despite, Andrew Coburn's the big, like, let's not do nuclear war guy, there seemed to be not sufficient, willingness to play out the obvious end game, which is that at some point there's going to have to be a compromise or we're all going to die. And the fact that this has been going on for 3 years now with still no real mainstream acknowledgement of this fact. And only blessedly, I can't believe I have to even say this, the Trump administration at least making noises about wanting it to end. It's dispiriting. It's dispiriting to be having this conversation. The broader geopolitical stakes conversation is interesting to me because the detail of, it's not a detail, it's like central, but like the fact of the choice between going NATO or going Russia as being the sparking point from which all of this sort of materialized. As a leftist, as a critic of the IMF and the World Bank, as a critic of how soft imperialism has worked, I wish that were foregrounded more. Because seen through that lens, so many of the world's conflicts become very obvious in so far as they're pointless. And to the extent that America and other nations try to dress these things up as noble fights for freedom and justice and, enlightenment values or whatever, it's so obviously not. And I honestly, I just don't, like, I felt myself not really wanting, I'm like, okay, Ukraine, like, I guess I got to do a Ukraine episode. I felt myself not wanting to do it, and I'm trying to emotionally kind of come to terms with why, and I think this is why. It's very frustrating. I mean, how are you feeling about it?
I mean, like I say, it's just particularly where I am now, in Belgrade, Serbia, where Serbia is historically has allied with Russia, has very strong cultural, historical connections, has been under constant pressure to sanction Russia since this started and side with the West. Not a particularly winning proposition, it seems. No, I mean, it is deeply worrying. And I think as well, particularly given the determination of European powers to keep this going, I mean, it wouldn't be a world war without the Balkans, and Winston Churchill once said the Balkans creates more history than it can consume. You have a situation here where there are effectively in Bosnia and Kosovo and elsewhere, you have puppet governments which are completely illegitimate and unpopular and backed up by scores of Western quote unquote peacekeepers. So, I mean, it would take, a stray trigger pull for something to pop off here. And, we know from the Georgian government Georgian government officials have claimed that they've been under immense pressure by Ukraine and its Western backers to open a second front against Russia. In a last-ditch effort to just keep this war going, what might you do? Stage some kind of provocation or false flag or whatnot? It's very, very, very dispiriting. And
well, they've already blown up a pipeline.
At the same. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that reeks of the desperation.
No depth. Yeah, there's quite literally no depth to which they won't sink. But also, as well, I think that what does give me some sense of optimism is that, on top of this basically being unsustainable, huge historical changes can happen in the blink of an eye and often by accident without anyone predicting them. Like the Berlin Wall fell by accident, therefore leading to the end of communism in Eastern Europe, in effect. So, I mean, as for what's next, it's not clear. But I mean, I maybe call me a bloody-minded optimist, but I do think that if the current talks between like Trump and the Russians, and again, it is positive in itself that these talks are happening at all. If we get some adults in the room who just say, well, look, this is completely crazy and we need to pull back. I mean, if you look at what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world came very close to all-out nuclear war, and at the very last moment, everyone, both the Soviet Union and the Americans were just like, okay, this is completely crazy and we need to just dial this down a bit. I mean, you're very clearly not going to get that level of sobriety and sense from Europe. But again, I mean, who listens to them anyway at this stage? So, I mean, we shall see. Although, I mean, given the current pace of change, next week we could see the war over, or we could see a major escalation. It's just so difficult to call, and that is, I mean, it's frightening, but it's also we are living witnesses to major changes in history. So.
Well, I hope for the sake of Ukrainians, you're right, that next week it's all wrapped up. I hope for the sake of this podcast that you're wrong, because I think this is going to come out on a little bit of a delay, so next week, and I don't want it to become irrelevant. But I really do appreciate your patience with me, sticking around for such a long conversation and really helping me get my thick skull around this issue. I'm increasingly believing, no, Brianna, it's not that your mind is a sieve and you're struggling to get your thick skull around this issue. It's just that it's all very silly and pointless and frustrating for me. But I appreciate you helping to come to that sort of revelation. Tell the people where they can find more of you and your excellent reporting.
Oh, thank you very much. You can find as you stated in the introduction, you can find my writing on the GrayZone. My friend Alex Rubenstein and I, we run an investigative project called Active Measures. You can find us on YouTube and Twitter. You can find me on Twitter as just Klarenberg. You won't be able to find me on Google that way. My account is just nowhere to be seen in search results. Likewise, my personal website, you can't find it on search engines either. I wonder why that is. But hopefully see you there. Thanks for having me on. Always a pleasure, never a burden.
I feel the same way. We'll have to have you back, especially if it's all wrapped up by next week, to give us a postmortem. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. You can get an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast every Monday at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Thanks for supporting independent media. And as always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.